place in the latter part of the 19th century. That would be the latter part of the 1800s. This is really the second industrial age, or some say the Industrial Revolution in America. There had been another industrial revolution in the latter part of the 18th century into the early part of the 19th century. So that'd be the latter part of the 1700s into the early part of the 1800s. Now, after the Civil War, after the American Civil War, there was much growth in the areas of industry, in the development of corporations, and that's what we're going to look at. Now, during this period, we can see a lot of good things happening. We can see bad things happening. There's one book that I've used sometimes in a U.S. history class, and it refers to this period as a period of wonder and woe. Wonder meaning the technological advancements that were occurring, the impressive buildings that were being built, and other structures such as bridges that were impressive, the advancements in, you might say, cultural activities, things like this. All this would be the wonder. But then there was the woe. The woe would be the harsh working conditions in many cases in the industries, the tough living conditions, you might say, tenement slums.
So let's talk about the emergence of big business, what is going to be needed. Before we do this, let me just kind of talk about in general the development of the economic system in the United States. Our business majors know this. We have a capitalistic economy, but we have a capitalistic economy that also has a safety net for people. That's why you have welfare programs, things like that. But it's been developing. That's you have a lot of safety regulations that the government enforces on industries. But the industries are still privately owned. They're not government owned. Again, capitalism has to do with the private ownership of the means of production, the means of distribution of goods and services, private ownership, and that encourages people to be creative, to people to have initiative. Uh, you know, today, people like Bill Gates, Microsoft, that was a capitalistic endeavor. He reaps great rewards for his efforts, gives a lot of people a lot of jobs, this type of thing. But through looking at the development of our economy, our economic system, and capitalism, what you go back to this industrial revolution in the latter part of the 1800s, and you can see at first there are not a lot of safety regulations in place. There's not a lot of government oversight. There's not a lot of supervision, you might say, to make sure that the industries are not, you know, creating unsafe conditions for workers and giving them harsh labor conditions, this type of thing. But what happens is as these large industries develop, and by the way, many of them, basically it's rags to riches stories. People that capitalism does, like I said, encourage people to take chances, invest, build business, build industries, and many people succeed at this. But for all those who succeed as entrepreneurs, many, many, many fail and don't make it. So it is a gamble for people. You know, it is a gamble. They take risk. We also see that many of the entrepreneurs that make it big end up doing charitable contributions, giving a lot of money to charity and this type of thing. So that's another element within the system. Many do create foundations and give to charities, and we'll see that too. But like I said, it's a two sides we're looking at. We're looking at the growth of the big business, the wonders of industry and technology, but then also we're looking at what the workers had to go through and how they struggled to get more to get better working conditions. And then we'll see what the government's role is in this. So it's a interesting story to look at, and let's look at it. All right. So what's needed for big business to emerge? Well, one thing that is needed is raw materials. Well, this country has a lot of raw materials. Um, there's a there um, for the you got coal, you have iron ore, just a plethora of raw materials. You got oil, this type of thing. Another factor for the emergence of big business is at this time in the latter part of the 19th century, there was a rapidly growing urban force. A lot of cheap labor. They were coming, immigrants were coming over, and so you had immigrants coming. You also had American born workers were moving from the rural areas to the manufacturing centers seeking opportunity. Because what's happening is in the farms, because of new technology, new inventions, and farming machinery and everything, not as many farm hands were needed. And so a lot of folks were moving into the city looking for opportunities. Also, women and children entered the workforce. Now, the bulk of the cheap labor is going to be coming from these immigrants and from these workers moving from the rural areas into the manufacturing centers, but also women and children are going to be entering the workforce, and that's going to be a big issue because I mean it's bad enough for the working conditions to be harsh for men, but then there was a concern when women and children, you have these kids. I'm talking kids, 8, 9, 10 years old, working in these industries and coming out maimed or being killed, and so there's going to be some big issues there. But nevertheless, cheap labor, particularly with the immigrants and the people moving off the farms, that's going to be needed for the emergence of big business because you need workers. Um, and few government restraints. Okay, now this is where it's going to get a little tricky because remember what I told you. If you look today, there are a lot of government regulations, a lot of concern about safety regulations and workers, safety of the workers, but also safety for the consumers. That's why you have things like the Food and Drug Administration today to try to safeguard the food and the pharmaceutical drugs that are produced. So, but at this time, few government regulations, I mean, there's not a lot of government regulation, actually is going to help the emergence of big business because the big businesses didn't have, they could work people at an extraordinary, just a extraordinarily large number of hours. They could, uh, you know, cut back on cost in the factory's safety uh, uh, cost. But of course, you cut back on safety uh, features in your industry, you're going to have more injuries and everything. But the point is this: the few government we're not having. When I say few government regulations, I didn't have a lot of government regulations. That is going to uh, allow businesses to actually grow. Okay, so keep that in mind. But on the flip side, like I said, it's also going to allow for harsh working conditions. Now, the major big businesses that are going to emerge are going to be the railroad industry, the steel industry, and the petroleum industry. Now, big business corporations are really going to begin with the railroad industry, and they're going to kind of set the tone for other industries. One thing that is really going to help with industrialization is going to be inventions, new technology. Inventions will enhance industrialization, and capitalism encourages creativity, inventions. Why does it encourage it? Well, because the inventor in a capitalistic society will reap the benefits, reap the profits. Um, and not only do the inventions, the inventor will profit from it, but also society will profit because the invention will be something to improve society, make work more productive, this type of thing. So we're going to see a lot of inventions during the latter part of the 1800s. Um, Patents a patent is if an inventor got a patent on his invention, what that meant is that people couldn't steal his invention. He had the rights to that invention. He was the one who would get the profits from that invention. And again, that people are encouraged to do that in capitalism. Think about it today. That TV show, The Shark Tank, or Shark Tank. I'll be honest with you, I've never watched an entire episode of it, but I have seen bits and pieces of it. And what's it about? It's about people who have invented things. They see something that they think would better society, would improve things in some way, would be something that people would want to use, this type of thing. And they try to get backers for it, somebody to finance them. Uh, they're inventors. And in the latter part of the 1800s, there was a lot of incentive for inventing, and there were a lot of uh, things that people saw that needed to be improved upon, and new inventions could help that. Well, for example, patents. These patents that were issued to show you how much uh, the area of creativity and initiative and inventions grew in the 1800s. From the mid 1800s, from in the 1850s, if you looked at the number of patents issued per year in the 1850s, it's about 1,000. You go to the 1890s, it was 20,000 patents per year. So a lot of patents being issued. In the 1890s, there were a total of 235,000 patents that were issued. Between 1860 and 1900, the GNP, the gross national product, that's the total value of the goods being produced in the country, rose 171%. Some of the inventors, important inventors of this time, Alexander Graham Bell, he got a patent on the telephone in 1876. Probably the best known inventor of the time was Thomas Alva Edison. He invented the photograph. He invented the first incandescent light bulb. He had other inventions: the storage battery, the dictaphone, the mimeograph machine, the electric motor, electric transmission, a modern motion picture camera and projector. He had many more. He had 1,093 patents for different inventions. Now all of them didn't work that well, but he definitely was a prime example of an inventor during this period. Um, the one machine on here that I always like to talk about is his mimeograph machine. It hasn't been that long ago that mimeograph machines were used. Especially teachers used to use mimeograph machines all the time before the photocopier. Mimeograph machines were still being used, I'd say, around the late 1970s, early 1980s is when they got discontinued, you might say. And what they were basically, these machines, they would have this big pad on them that had ink, and you would have to type on mimeograph paper, would kind of indented on the paper, and then you put the paper with the indentation on the mimeograph machine, and that pad with the blue ink on it, it would soak in. Basically, you'd fill the machine with blank paper. You'd run the machine through the drum that the mimeograph paper was on. Would go around and around. As it went around and around, paper would be fed in, and the indented blue ink would come out on the paper. So again, through another invention, the photocopy machine put the mimeograph machine out of business. Okay, so there's an example. Edison had the Edison Electric Illuminating Company in 1882, um, and electric motors were going to allow factories to locate anywhere. That's a big factor in the growth of industry during this time. Now, one person that, you think about Edison and electricity, but you ought to think a lot about Nikola Tesla also when it comes to electricity. Um, he developed systems that produced and used alternating current. Edison used direct current. And I want to share with you a kind of little biography on Tesla. Now, some people have heard of Tesla today because of the Tesla Motor Company. That's who it's named after, is Nikola Tesla, because of his work with electricity. Again, I think Tesla hasn't gotten, I don't think, probably the recognition he should as an inventor, and particularly with his work in electricity. So I want to take just a couple of minutes here to read you his biography on Tesla. All right, Nikola Tesla was a pioneer in electrical technology. Tesla received more than 100 patents for a variety of inventions, but he is best known for his development of systems that produce and use alternating current, AC. That is, electric current that reverses direction regularly many times a second. To this day, systems developed by Tesla remain the heart of electric power operations in most of the world. I'm going to repeat that one, okay? Because everybody knows of the great work that Edison did, but Tesla's work, to this day, systems developed by Tesla remain the heart of electric power operations in most of the world. Tesla was born in Austria-Hungary, which is now in Croatia, or now it would be the part of Austria-Hungary where he was born is now Croatia, to Serbian parents. He studied engineering at two institutions in Austria-Hungary, the Graz Technical University and the University of Prague. Tesla left the University of Prague in 1880 without a degree after his father died. Some of these inventors, they didn't finish their degree. I mean, think Bill Gates didn't finish his degree. But anyway, Tesla didn't finish his degree. He then worked for a short time for Austria-Hungary's telephone system in Budapest. In 1882, Tesla moved to Paris, where he worked for the Continental Edison Company. While at Graz Technical University, Tesla had seen a demonstration of a generator run as a direct current. Again, remember that's what Edison worked with, as a direct current motor. Direct current is electric current that flows in only one direction. During the demonstration, the brushes and the commutator of the motor sparked violently. The brushes are devices that conduct the current in a DC motor. The commutator continually reverses the current so that the motor continues to rotate in one direction. Tesla believed a motor without a commutator could be devised. In 1881, while walking in a park, Tesla suddenly got an idea for a simple way to produce such a device. In 1883, while on assignment for Continental Edison in Strasbourg, France, Tesla used his spare time to build his first polyphase, that is, out-of-step, AC motor. In such a motor, coils are arranged so that when out-of-step alternating currents energize them, the resulting magnetic field rotates at a predetermined speed. In 1884, Tesla left Europe for the United States and went to work for the inventor Thomas Edison. Edison respected the young engineer, but the American inventor was a strong supporter of DC, and so he had little interest in Tesla's AC generation, transmission, and motor system. Guess what? Tesla quit Edison after 1 year because Edison wasn't interested in the AC work. He was interested in the DC work. So what does Tesla do? In 1887, Tesla started the Tesla Electric Company in New York City. There he produced 3 complete systems of AC machinery. For each system, Tesla designed generators to supply the current, motors that use the current, transformers to raise and lower voltages, and a variety of devices to automatically control the machinery. Tesla received patents for his polyphase system of AC generators, transformers, and motors in 1888. Again, patents. That same year, he sold his patents to U.S. industrialist George Westinghouse. Westinghouse, you used to see Westinghouse appliances all over, but anyway, Tesla electrical appliances. Tesla then worked at the Westinghouse Electric Company in Pittsburgh for a year to help develop commercial uses of the AC system. Tesla became a U.S. citizen in 1889. In 1893, Westinghouse used Tesla's AC system to light the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. It's a World's Fair. In 1895, World's Fair, they show off a lot of the new inventions, this type of thing. In 1895, Westinghouse Niagara Falls Power Project used Tesla's generators and motors to harness the power of the waterfall. The project produced AC power and delivered it to Buffalo, New York, 22 miles from the falls. In 1891, Tesla invented the Tesla coil, a type of high-frequency transformer that is still used in radio and television transmission. He experimented with wireless control, and in 1898 he demonstrated a radio-controlled boat he had invented. In 1899, Tesla created artificial lighting in one of his laboratories. Tesla's other achievements include early experiments with X-rays and radar, aircraft design, and the invention of neon and fluorescent lighting. Now, in 1943, the Supreme Court of the United States invalidated most of the patents held by the Italian inventor Marconi. What is Marconi famous for? The radio. Well, the Supreme Court, it invalidated most of his patents for radio communications equipment. The patents that he had on radio communication equipment were invalidated by the Supreme Court. So Marconi's patents on radio communications equipment pretty much invalidated. Why? It gave Tesla credit for the invention of the radio based on various patents in his name that predated Marconi's. In 1956, now of course, Tesla, he was, this was a big win for Tesla. Now, Tesla actually passed away in 1943, the year Supreme Court ruled on that. But anyway, in 1975, Tesla was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. So Tesla is a very, very important inventor. Of note during this period were people like George Eastman. He invented the Kodak camera. Now, a lot of you probably aren't familiar with the Kodak camera nowadays because you can just take pictures with your cell phone and everything, but Kodak developed in a very big camera company. It's interesting today because of the fact that people can just take pictures off their camera with their telephones. Kodak is kind of diversifying. Recently, it was announced that they were going to get into producing pharmaceuticals. So they're making a transition, basically. But Kodak camera was a big invention. William S. Burroughs invented the adding machine. Of course, that's going to be very helpful in businesses. Isaac Singer had the sewing machine. You may have heard of Singer sewing machines. And Jan Maslingers invented a machine that pretty much revolutionized the shoe industry. He was a lasting machine. What it does basically, it shapes and fastens the leather of the shoe onto the sole of the shoe. This is something. This process had previously been done by hand with laborers shaping and fastening the leather over the shoes by hand. But now with the lasting machine that Maslingers invented, it's going to lead to the mass production of shoes. It's also going to greatly reduce their price. That's another thing about the inventions. Not only do inventions make production more efficient, but in making production more efficient, it typically will lower the price of goods. Think about it today. Think about when computers first came out or when TVs first came out. They were much more expensive, but as technology improved on the production of these items, cost went down. So that was important. But Maslingers is an interesting guy. He was a black man born in Dutch Guiana, which is now Suriname. And as a boy, he worked in a government machine shop. In 1873, he moves to Philadelphia. He gets a job working as a shoe cobbler. And then in 1877, he took a job in a shoe factory as industries are expanding, this type of thing. Well, he saw this need. Again, that's what inventors see needs. They see a need for things, and he saw a need to make have a more efficient way of shaping and fastening the leather onto the sole of the shoe. And so he invents this machine. And he finished his work on the machine in 1882. He got a patent on the machine in 1883. Remember what patents are. But now he did have a little problem. He didn't have enough money to produce and sell the machine himself. And so in 1885, he ends up selling his patent. So he turns his patent over to a company in Lynn, Massachusetts. This company later becomes the United Shoe Machinery Company. Matzingler unfortunately died at a fairly young age. He was 37. He died of tuberculosis, and so he only was able to partly share in the great profits that resulted from his invention. But anyway, so those are a few more of the inventors. There are many other ones, but those were a few. The railroads are going to become the symbol of the urban industrial revolution. And one of the big things that occurs is the United States being connected from coast to coast by the railroads. Uh, excuse me. What had happened was in 1862, during the Civil War, the Pacific Railroad Acts were passed. There were a series of acts that promoted the construction of a transcontinental railroad going across the continent from coast to coast. So, and what happened is through these acts, government bonds were issued. Bonds are basically where the government they sell bonds, meaning people buy the bonds, and what they're doing is people are loaning money to the government. The government will pay back the bonds. When you cash in the bonds, you get interest for however long you kept the bonds. But the government also gave grants of land to railroad companies because the government argued that railroads generated economic growth. And so that was justification for giving land grants to the railroad companies. So as the Civil War was intensifying, President Lincoln wrestled with the question of how to connect the existing railroad network in the Midwest with California. And then during the spring of 1862, the House and the Senate passed the Pacific Railroad Act, which authorized these land grants and loans, it goes to the bonds, um, varying from $16,000 per mile or when it was on the flat prairie area to $48,000 per mile when it was going through the mountains. So it was kind of a pay-as-you-go program, but it was very important for the growth of the country, and the it was complete. What you ended up having, and you had basically two railroad companies that were working on this. You had the Union Pacific that was building west from Omaha, Nebraska, and the Central Pacific that was building east from Sacramento, California. And they met at Promontory, Utah, or Promontory Point, Utah, in 1869, and that was when it was completed. Okay, here you just see the graphic of the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Um, you can see going west from Omaha and east from Sacramento and meeting at Promontory Point, Utah. So the most dramatic change in the 19th century industrial economy was the emergence of large corporations, and railroads are going to set the tone for that. They're going to be the trailblazers, basically, as far as large corporations. Now, corporations are business organizations established by groups of individuals and owned by people who buy shares of stock in the companies. That's how you get corporations. After 1865, railroads and the telegraph would allow entrepreneurs to expand their businesses. You've got these huge corporations that start to be formed with thousands of employees in a single factory complex. You have these industries that have operations in several states. Millions of dollars of capital investment are raised from the sale of stock. So, like I said, that's kind of in general what was going on with the industries, but and corporations. But railroads are the ones that really um, kind of their practices were copied by other industries. So let's talk about the railroads in a more detail. Um, thing about railroads, they could be built anywhere. So it's not like uh, when you build railroads, they can go anywhere so uh, that people can establish towns pretty much anywhere because railroads can go anywhere. Businesses can be established pretty much anywhere the railroads go. This type of thing. Where if you're dependent on water travel, you got to be near a waterway, of course. So this type of thing. So railroads could be built anywhere. Um, they provided relatively fast transportation at that time. With the Intercontinental Railroad, you've got now coast to coast railroad service. It was a quicker and cheaper way to transport um, uh, finished products or to transport raw materials to factories, this type of things. So with railroads, railroads are going to equal new settlements, new towns, because like I said, you can build them anywhere. Now, the railroad industry is going to um, form these giant corporations. Um, for example, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Central Railroad. These were huge corporations that were formed, and they bought out. Basically, there'd been fierce competition among railroad companies, and there would be these buyouts. And the two giant railroad corporations that were first formed were Pennsylvania Railroad, New York Central Railroad. Two key individuals associated with the growth of railroads were Cornelius Vanderbilt and Jay Gould. Now, Cornelius Vanderbilt, he also was involved in shipping, and that's why little trivia point here. I think most of you, hopefully all of you, have heard of Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. And I don't know if you know their nickname. Their nickname, the Vanderbilt, excuse me, Vanderbilt University, they are the Commodores. And the reason they're called the Commodores is because Cornelius Vanderbilt, who basically gave money for the school to be established, Vanderbilt was this shipping tycoon, and they called him a Commodore. He was a Commodore. He was commander of ships, basically. But he also was very much involved with the railroad industry, and so was Jay Gould. Now, the large railroad corporations led to the modernization of business practices. That's what I was telling you earlier as far as they were the trailblazers. Um, so the success of the large railroad corporations, what they did to be successful, pretty much spread to other corporations, other businesses. So again, leading to the modernization of business practices in two very important ways. One, they allowed the railroads allowed other businesses to see the advantages of incorporating and issuing stocks. Now other corporations saw, hey, the railroads, they were pretty successful. These large railroad companies like Pennsylvania Railroad, New York Central Railroad, they were successful. One of the big reasons is because they sold shares of stock. So you see other corporations, they copy that so that they can build their industries. And two, huge railroad corporations encourage the development of modern, sophisticated management practices. For example, there was a lot of standardization that occurred. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that the reason we have time zones is because of the railroad industry. Uh, Before the railroad industry created the standardized time zones, what would happen is you'd have different times in different states, different parts of the country. Um, and I'm not talking, okay, with standardized times, you have the time zones, but it's like, okay, 3 o'clock Eastern is 2 o'clock Central. Okay. They might be before the standardization. It might be 3 o'clock in New York, and it might be, I don't know, 1:10 in Alabama or something. It was totally there was no standardization of the time, and that's a problem if you're running trains. It could lead to train wrecks because they're not on the, you got the trains running on these tracks and they're leaving, one's leaving one state and at a certain time, but in another state it's a different time, but they're leaving at that different time. It's very confusing. Okay. And again, it could lead to a lot of, it could lead to disaster basically. So that's when time zones get established. In 1883, 4 time zones were established. Also, you see standardization of equipment, things like the couplers on the railroad tracks, signals, brakes, the gauge of the tracks, they're standardized so that different train companies, the tracks, the gauges are the same. So all of those things were important, but that's what other corporations learn is to standardize their practices basically. Standardization. Well, remember we talked about the chapter being entitled Wonder and Woe, and I mentioned how the wonder was all the great advancements and this type of thing, great buildings, great technology developing. Well, the railroads themselves, it's going to be wonder and woe here as far as how they're viewed. They're going to be you're going to see the proponents of railroads saying that, look, railroads are great. They're inexpensive way to travel, inexpensive way to transport goods. It's speedy travel. This is great for the country. The poet Walt Whitman said of the railroads that they were the modern railroad was the modern emblem of motion and power, the pulse of the continent. The pulse of the continent, that's the heartbeat. Whitman is saying railroads are the heartbeat of the country. Without the heartbeat, you're not going to survive. So that's how important uh, he felt that the railroads were. And again, many echoed his sentiment. On the flip side, there were a lot of people who compared the railroad industry to a ravenous octopus with all these arms just taking over everything basically. They felt that there was a fear of monopoly in the railroad industry with just one or two railroad companies or a handful of railroad companies controlling transportation in the country, that there was too much power in the hands of a few, and that the railroad executives would use their wealth to bribe government officials, and they would manipulate the stock, and they would exploit workers, and there was shoddy construction on the railroad lines that led to accidents. There were unsafe operating conditions, and the farmers were really concerned about price gouging of the farmers because again, the farmers didn't have much of a choice as far as transporting their product to market and everything, and so they could be uh, uh, charged unfair amounts basically, and also some of the some of the smaller manufacturers uh, could be uh, they would have to pay more than say large corporations for transporting, and so there was the fear of price gouging. So you have the pro and the con about the railroads. The concern over the excessive power of railroads led some reformers to seek tighter regulation of the industry. One group that sought a tighter regulation was the Grange. And what the Grange was, it was a social and educational society for farmers. Okay, so at first it's just like I said, social and educational, but it develops into a major political force in the Midwest in the mid 1870s. And it was originally founded in the fall of 1867 by Oliver H. Kelly. And what the Grange pushed for, as they got more into being a political movement, they pushed for reforms that would regulate prices and outlaw unfair business practices of the railroads. All right, so make sure you know some things about the railroad industry. Let's talk about a couple of other industries, the steel industry and the industry. Let's talk about the industry. Steel was the essential ingredient in transforming America into an industrialized society. You have to have steel to build these um, uh, skyscrapers. Steel is going to be used to make better uh, uh, machinery, things like this. Steel is many times stronger than just pure iron, basically. Now, the individual who is most influential in the uh, steel industry, probably the single most influential big businessman of the era, was Andrew Carnegie, or if you want to be more accurate in the Scottish pronunciation of his name, it's Carnegie. But usually everybody says Carnegie, so I'm going to say Carnegie. But anyway, Carnegie. Um, Let me just kind of give you an overview of Carnegie, and then I'm going to give you more of a more details on his life because he's really interesting. But anyway, in 1870, Carnegie moved entirely into steel production. He worked his way up. He started working in railroad area, and then he worked his way up, and then he got into the steel area. And by 1870, he was entirely into steel production. And his fundamental principle was reduce production costs to the lowest possible level. And if you did that, you would be successful. He would hire the brightest staff he could. He invested heavily in the latest technology. He was the first to invest in what was called the Bessemer-Kelly process of steel production. That's Bessemer hyphen Kelly, Kelly, the Bessemer-Kelly process of steel production, which was a process that allowed you to make a better grade of steel. He also pioneered what was called vertical integration. Um, in the business area, you got vertical and horizontal integration when you talk about businesses. Um, Horizontal integration, let me tell you what that is first. Horizontal integration is where one company producing a certain product would buy out other companies producing that same product. Um, but vertical integration, and by the way, Carnegie did use horizontal integration also, but he pioneered vertical integration, where in vertical integration, what a business would do would be to buy out all the major phases of production of a particular product. So in the steel industry, instead of just having the steel manufacturing companies, he would buy out mines, okay, iron ore mines, because you have to have iron ore to make steel. He would buy out or he would own smelting operations. That's where you purify the iron ore, basically. He would buy out railroads to transport his steel and to transport raw materials to his factory, and ships. He'd buy those. He'd have ships too. So vertical integration is where you're basically controlling everything from getting the resources to manufacture the product, to transporting the product or the raw materials to the factory, to producing the product, to then shipping out the product or storing the product, this type of thing. Vertical integration, all major phases of production are controlled um, by one company or one individual, whatever. In this case, Carnegie. So he pioneered vertical integration. He bought out many, well, like I said, with horizontal integration, he would buy out companies producing the same product, but then he would also buy out companies that were in different phases of the production process. There was a lot of cutthroat practices going on, driving out the competitors. There were secret deals that were made with railroads to get his product transported at a lower rate, this type of thing. By 1900, Carnegie Steel was the largest corporation in the world. Also by 1900, the U.S. steel industry employed 272,000 workers. Now, this is steel industry in general. Of course, Carnegie is a major part of it. But they employed 272,000 workers who that year in 1900 produced 10.4 million tons of steel, twice that of their nearest competitors in other countries, Germany and Great Britain. So you can see how important that was. Um, in 1901, Carnegie sold the Carnegie Steel Company for 480 million to J.P. Morgan. We'll talk about him a little bit later on. And then after he retired, he devoted his life to writing and promoting worthy causes. So that's kind of an overview of Carnegie, but I want to give you um, a little more detail because he is a very interesting person in our history, and he is a rags to riches story. Um, he was Scottish born. He was born in Scotland. And like I said, he became the leading steel manufacturer in the United States, one of the wealthiest individuals of his time. And as I said, when he retired, he also became a great philanthropist. Remember, I think I mentioned earlier, a lot of people who become wealthy use their, you know, actually get into charitable work and foundations and this type of thing. Anyway, uh, Carnegie was born in a place called Dunfermline, Scotland. His father was a weaver, weaving cloth. Okay, and after the power looms began to replace hand weaving, because his dad he wove cloth by hand, but then you have power looms being invented. The Carnegies immigrated to the United States to look for more opportunities. The family needed more opportunities, and America was a land of opportunity. Well, when they get over here, Andrew is only about 12 years old, and they settle in a place called Allegheny City, Pennsylvania. Today, Allegheny City is part of Pittsburgh. Andrew, again, rags to riches. He goes to work as a kid, working in a cotton mill. He later becomes a telegraph messenger. He taught himself how to send telegraph messages and then worked his way up to become a telegraph operator when he was 17. In 1853, he got a job as a clerk and telegraph operator for the Pennsylvania Railroad, remember, one of those really huge railroad companies. He later became a secretary for one of the railroad's division superintendents, a man by the name of Thomas A. Scott. Scott basically became like a mentor to him. And with Scott's help, Carnegie was able to advance in the firm, and eventually he succeeds Scott. In other words, he follows Scott's, he's Scott's successor as the superintendent of the railroad. Then during the Civil War breaks out, 1861 to 1865, and during that time, Carnegie helps to organize telegraph services for the Union Army. Now, while he was working for the Pennsylvania Railroad, Carnegie invested in several iron companies. So he took money that he was making, he invested it. One of those companies was the Keystone Bridge Company, which built iron railroad bridges. He also purchased stock in an oil company and in the Woodruff Sleeping Car Company, which manufactured railroad sleeping cars. Sleeping cars are what they say what exactly what the name implies. These are railroad cars that people would sleep in as they traveled on the railroad trains. Um, Carnegie left the Pennsylvania Railroad Company in 1865 to run uh, businesses on his own. In 1872, he goes to Europe to sell bonds to European investors. And while he's over there, uh, he kind of look what's going down around in the industry over there, and he comes to the realization that steel is the way to go. That the demand for steel would increase in the years ahead, and that's when he really gets committed to entering the steel industry. In 1873, he and several partners bought land near Pittsburgh and established the J. Edgar Thompson Works steel mill. It became one of the largest and most modern steel mills of its time. Now, here's where Carnegie, this is where you really appreciate Carnegie's ability as an entrepreneur. There is a nationwide business slump in the 1870s. Um, Basically, recession, depression occurring, business slump. That's not good for businesses normally, but Carnegie turned it into an advantage. So there's this business slump from about 1873 to 1879. Now, even though there's a slump, Carnegie decides to expand his steel company. And when you get into the early 1880s, business revived. Well, guess who's all ready for that revival? Carnegie. Because when businesses revive, there's going to be a greater demand for steel. Carnegie had prepared for that. Carnegie's mills are going to earn millions of dollars. Then there's another business slump in around 1883. Most steel companies suffered, but guess what? Carnegie continued to expand his industry. In 1883, Carnegie purchased the Homestead steel mill, the Homestead Works. It was one of the largest competing steel mills at the time. Remember horizontal integration? You buy up other companies that are doing the same thing that you're producing, the same thing that you're producing. Carnegie bought up the Homestead mill. There's going to be a problem there, I'll tell you about later. But anyway, um, he also bought a majority of the stock in a Coke company that had been established by Henry Clay Frick, who was an American industrialist, and then Frick becomes one of his partners. Now, well, first off, let me tell you this: when I say a Coke company, C-O-K-E, first, I'm not talking about bad stuff, and second, I'm not talking about the drink. Um, Coke is basically a derivative of coal that is used in the smelting process. But anyway, Henry Clay Frick, who was an American industrialist that became his partners, what happens is Frick is he's pretty hard nosed. He's pretty brutal. Whereas Carnegie liked to view himself as a friend to the workers. Just keep that in mind because when we have the Homestead strike, you'll see how that plays out with Frick and everything. All right, then in 1892, Carnegie combined three of his companies to form a single company called Carnegie Steel Company. Frick becomes the chairman of that company, and he took responsibility for the daily operations. Carnegie basically would handle kind of the overall outlook, the company's investment, long-range planning, stuff like that. Okay, now, so Carnegie's very successful. Um, some of his success related to his sales ability. He would, his ability to sell his product. He also would outbid his competitors and create a talent, and he created a very talented management team. He also, like I said earlier, he would expand his industry when there was economic decline, when most of his competitors are cutting back, and it worked for him. Now, remember what I told you, entrepreneurs, for every entrepreneur that makes it big, there's many, many that don't make it. Carnegie made it big. Okay. So Carnegie, while other companies are cutting back, he's expanding. He enlarges the facilities uh, in an inexpensive way because his costs to expand were reduced during economic downturns. Um, and so he's going to be able to meet the demand, the increased demand for steel when the economy bounces back. All right, now I told you I would say something about the Homestead strike, so let me go ahead and do that now. In 1892, steel workers at Carnegie's Homestead plant went on strike because they had received a wage cut. Okay, there was economic downturn that occurred at this point. And they received a wage cut. Carnegie was in Scotland at the time, and Frick was handling things, and Frick refused to bargain with the union leaders. Now, there's some indication that actually Carnegie went to Scotland precisely because there were some problems with the factory and the workers. He viewed himself, he wanted to be viewed in a good light by the workers. And meanwhile, Frick, like I said, he's the guy that's the hammer, so to speak. And so Carnegie leaves it up to Frick. And Frick refuses to bargain with the union leaders. Frick decided to reopen the plant by force, and he hired Pinkerton guards from the Pinkerton Detective Agency to protect non-union workers that were being brought in to replace the strikers. Well, fighting breaks out between the guards and the strikers. Several people were killed. Now, there are different accounts of this. I actually saw a presentation. It was a series, and this is part of the series of the men who built America. And in that presentation, it is totally a presentation that presents the Carnegie people, excuse me, the Pinkerton forces that Frick brought in as being totally at fault and totally just vicious. But then I've also read some accounts that basically say that really the strikers had kind of started the violence. So I don't know. We'd have to do a little more research on this because I've seen the accounts two different ways. One, the strikers started the violence, and two, the Pinkerton guards really were just uh, beating up on defenseless strikers, basically. So again, this is one of these questions in history that, what actually happened. Probably need to do a little more investigation, and maybe we won't know for sure, but there are different accounts of that one. Um, the So anyway, fighting breaks out, like I said, between the guards and the strikers. Several people end up being killed. State militia have to come in and restore order and then reopen the plant. What ended up happening, most of the strikers ended up quitting the union and returned to work, and so the strike did fail. Um, Now, while all this was going on, Carnegie was not saying a whole lot in Scotland. Um, he was kind of laying low. Remember, he pretty much claimed to be a friend of the workers, claimed to support labor unions, claimed to oppose the use of force to end a strike. Um, he was trying to maintain his reputation, basically. But later, he is criticized for keeping silent. Um, Many people thought that by keeping silent, he was basically endorsing what Frick was doing. Anyway, as I said, in 1901, Carnegie ends up selling his company to J.P. Morgan, who was an American banker. He retires. It said that Morgan said to Carnegie when he bought the Carnegie Steel Company, he said, "Mr. Morgan, excuse me, not Mr. Morgan, Mr. Carnegie, I want to congratulate you on being the richest man in the world." And Carnegie's fortune at that time was estimated at 500 million, which would be many in today's money. It would be multiple times that. I don't know exactly how much, but it'd be a lot more than 500 million. Um, Morgan ended up. He and other manufacturers later combined their companies to form the United States Steel Corporation, U.S. Steel, which is still around. After Carnegie retired, he devoted his time largely to writing and promoting worthy causes. Again, this is not unusual for wealthy entrepreneurs when they retire in their later years to start redirecting their um, focus on philanthropy and charity. Um, Even some do that before they retire, but especially when they retire, you see a lot doing that. Anyway, uh, he wrote a essay called Wealth, published in 1889, and in that essay he outlined his ideas on using large fortunes for improving society. He also wrote some books. Uh, Carnegie believed basically that people could improve themselves through hard work. So Carnegie's really not one to just hand out money to folks. He he's more of a mind, I guess you might say. If you've ever heard the expression, if you give a man a fish, you feed him for one day. If you teach a man to fish, you feed him for the rest of his life. I think he's more in that vein, teach a man to fish, because he did think that people could, the way they improve themselves is by working hard. Now, why do you think he thinks that? Well, look at his life. That's what he did. Okay. He also thought that wealthy individuals should use their fortunes to aid society. But here again, how? Is it just giving out money and not really expecting anything from the people that he gives it to? No. He opposed just giving money and without anything being expected from the person getting it. He believed that what he believed in was helping others to help themselves, chiefly by providing educational opportunities. Now, I always say education is the great equalizer. If you want to keep any people down, just don't let them get educated. Now, my dad always used to say, nobody can take your education away from you. And my parents immigrated from Greece, and so they came. They actually met over here, but they both came from Greece, both coming over for opportunities here. My mom's family, and then my dad came over by himself, but meeting, for coming for opportunities. But education, uh, again, in my family, that's what he always, I mean, both my parents really pushed for that. Well, that's what Carnegie is saying here basically is he's going to provide educational opportunities. He's going to fund educational opportunities to help people to help themselves. He donated about $350 million to various causes. He established over 2,500 public libraries throughout the world. Again, this is the idea of providing educational opportunities. He financed the construction of the Carnegie Hall, which is a famous concert hall in New York City. He financed also a group of technical schools that are now part of what's called Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. Um, the Carnegie Institution of Washington was established to encourage research in the biological and physical sciences. Uh, so again, those are just a few of them. There are more that he established, but uh, again, I've spent a good amount of time here talking about Carnegie, but I think it's important for you to get a kind of a handle on and look at what an entrepreneur like Carnegie, how he rose to great economic power and influence, and you know what he did with his money, this type of thing. So, all righty, let's go on. J. Pierpont Morgan was a great financier, banker. He was an investment banker. He used his money to acquire and reorganize railroad lines. You see kind of a connection here with how important the railroads are in business, and how, we talked about Carnegie having he got a start really in the railroad industry. We see Morgan acquiring railroad lines because he understood the value of them. Like I said earlier, he bought out Carnegie Steel Industry in 1901, and his corporation, U.S. Steel Corporation, became the first billion-dollar industry in the country. All right, the other major industry at this time that I want to talk about is the oil industry. We've talked about the railroad industry, we've talked about the steel industry. What about the oil industry? Well, John D. Rockefeller is the guy you've got to know when you talk about the oil industry at this time. He came to dominate the oil industry. Rockefeller, by 1879, his company, Standard Oil, the company he established, controlled more than 80% of the nation's oil refining capacity. Now, initially, Rockefeller expanded his industry using horizontal integration. Again, that's buying or building oil refineries. That was the area he refined oil. But later he employed vertical integration, where he bought the oil fields, he bought the railroad cars, he bought the warehouses to store the oil, he bought the pipelines, and he bought barrel factories to put the oil, the barrel factories of manufacturing barrels to put the oil in. So just like Carnegie, he's going to use horizontal and vertical. Like I said, Carnegie pioneered the vertical integration. Rockefeller's chief contribution to the rise of big business was the invention of two new forms of corporate management, the trust and the holding company. Um, what had happened before you have the trust and the holding company? A method of corporate management was the creation of a pool. And a pool was basically a secret deal between apparent rival companies, at least on the surface, secret deals between apparent rival companies to set production limits to keep prices high and award each member of the pool a certain share of the market. Um, Now, there were problems with the pool. They a lot of times didn't work too well, and so Rockefeller comes up with a couple of other ideas. He developed the trust. The trust is a legally binding arrangement that brought many companies in the same industry under the direction of a single board of trustees, hence the name trust. So you got the single board of trustees that's really over several companies. Okay. To join a trust company, not a trust company, to join a trust, a company would have to turn over to a board of trustees a majority of its stocks in exchange for what were called trust certificates, which would guarantee to that company a share of the profits. Okay. Standard Oil. Rockefeller created a trust, the Standard Oil Trust. 40 companies under a 9-member board of trustee was uh, was created here in this trust, and of course the board of trustees was headed by Rockefeller. Now, a lot of people got concerned about trusts, that they were these giant monopolies basically occurring, and so there was a lot of pressure as far as pushing for the government to do something about trust and breaking up trust and this type of thing. Now, remember at this time, the government is pretty much trying to have hands off, let industries kind of do whatever they want to do. But, um, you know, there was this there was this outcry by a lot of people, this alarm by a lot of people that, hey, trust could be very detrimental. And but the Congress and courts, they were pretty unwilling to cut back on the power of big business. Now, I will say that we will see some antitrust legislation being passed, specifically the Sherman Antitrust Act, but it's not going to be enforced that much. But still, there's Rockefeller's going to start to be a little concerned about maybe the government might start cracking down on trust, and so that's when you have him come up with another method, the holding company. But before I do that, let me just mention this: the there were a couple of that court cases that shows that the government pretty much was backing big business. There was the court case of Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific Railway Company. Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific Railway Company. That's the name of the railroad company, Wabash, St. Louis, and Pacific, versus Illinois. And in that case, it was in 1886. In that case, the Supreme Court ruled that state railroad commissions did not have the authority to impose regulations on railroads because only Congress had the right to regulate interstate commerce. Okay, so that was really a win for big business because Congress wasn't doing a whole lot to control the industry. In 1886, there was also the court case of Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. In that case, the Supreme Court declared that corporations were de facto persons. De facto means basically, okay, they're not really real persons, but they're going to be treated like real persons, and thus protected by the 14th Amendment, which said they had to have due process, equal protection under the law. So that helped industrialists. Now, in 1887, we do actually see Congress attempt to restrict the power of railroads by establishing the Interstate Commerce Commission and making pools and rebates illegal. So again, with the pools, again, they weren't working that well, and now they're being declared illegal. And again, what did we say? We said that Rockefeller had come up with the trust to take the place of pools, basically. So anyway, but the Supreme Court, even though the Interstate Commerce Commission was created, the ICC, Interstate Commerce Commission, it was weak and ineffective, And if court cases came up where the Interstate Commerce Commission was trying to crack down on an industry, pretty much the Supreme Court would side with for example, the railroads. From 1887 to 1905, there were 16 legal cases in which the railroads challenged the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, what they were mandating or regulating. The railroad corporations won 15 times. Okay. Um, as you can see, Congress was being unduly influenced by big business. Well, in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was actually passed. So here you do have some legislation against trust, but it was vaguely worded and it was essentially unenforceable. As a result, only 18 antitrust cases were prosecuted by the Justice Department between 1890 and 1904. But even so, like I said, that was one of the things that really this fear that the government would start cracking down on trust led Rockefeller to come up with the holding company. And in the holding company, what would happen is basically a huge corporation would buy out and run other companies by purchasing their stock, getting a majority of the stock, at least 51% of the stock of other companies. And so you would basically, in essence, create a huge um, super corporations. But even though the companies were you have individual companies, one big company has at least 51% of the stock of the other company, so they're controlling it basically. But this holding company management method offered protection against the Sherman Antitrust Act because it's not like you had a board of trustees over them all. You just add the individual companies, but there was a bigger company that controlled the stock basically, or had a majority share of the stock. By 1900, 1% of corporations controlled 33% of the nation's manufacturing output. By 1910, the figure was 44%. 1% of corporations controlled 44% of the nation's manufacturing output. In 1900, only 7 corporations controlled 2/3 of the nation's railroad tracks. So you can see there are definitely some big corporations, and there are some issues about not having much regulation over them. Now, Rockefeller, he used some really brutal business tactics and harsh treatment of his workers and everything, but um, after he retired, uh, he devoted the final years of his life to philanthropy. He gave away about $540 million during his lifetime. He gave most of his money to the public through foundations that he established himself and through other organizations. Um, Institutions that got money from Rockefeller included the Rockefeller Foundation, the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, which was later renamed Rockefeller University, the University of Chicago, the General Education Board, things like this. So he too did get into philanthropy. Okay, I just on this slide just have really kind of a look at some of the key industry leaders. Some of these we've already talked about, like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Morgan, but other ones, Philip Armour and Gustavus Swift, they made their money in meat packing. James B. Duke, who Duke University, he contributed money to create Duke University. He made his money through tobacco products, the tobacco business. We already talked about George Eastman and the Kodak camera. Cyrus McCormick, he was an industry leader in farm equipment and producing farm equipment. Like I said, Carnegie was steel, Rockefeller oil, J.P. Morgan, investment banker. Now, here at the bottom of this slide, I have a little question. Were these leaders captains of industry or were they robber barons? That, see, in you have people that will look at these guys, and you got folks that are very anti-capitalist and they're just all they can say are bad things about them, and then you got folks that are very pro-capitalist that it's just all good things. But what was it in reality? Were they captains of industry, which is a very positive way to view these people. A captain of industry, that sounds noble, that sounds good. Robber baron, doesn't sound too good. What was a robber baron? Well, historically, a robber baron was back in the medieval period, it was a nobleman who would rob travelers who were passing through his lands. And so that term was now applied in the latter part of the 1800s to mean a ruthlessly powerful capitalist or industrialist of the late 19th century, considered to have become wealthy by exploiting natural resources, by corrupting legislators, or by other unethical means like abusing workers and this type of thing, taking advantage of workers. So were these guys, were they robber barons or were they captains of industry? You probably have a mixture in all of them. Rockefeller was probably most often denounced as a robber baron. He was probably considered the most brutal in his tactics and the most conniving, you might say, and exploiting people and this type of thing. But on the other hand, was he also a captain of industry? I'd say yeah. I'd say again, you probably have a little bit of or various degrees of robber baron and captain of industry in all of them. With the growth of industry, producing of goods, various goods, it's not going to do much good to produce things if there aren't buyers out there. In a capitalist economy, you've got to have buyers, and that's what causes people to create things and to sell basically and to improve on how to produce things so they can sell more. But so you got to have this mass market. And what's going to develop is sophisticated advertising and marketing strategies. Now, today, any business makers, that's a big deal. I mean, their degrees, I may have in my class uh, marketing majors. Marketing's a big deal. Well, here we see kind of the early stages of marketing really developing as far as strategies are concerned, and sophisticated advertising really developing, slogans, impressive claims by celebrity, impressive claims and of what a product can do or how it can benefit you. Also, we see celebrity endorsements coming about. That's a huge deal nowadays, which I've never really quite figured out. Just because some athlete or some movie star likes something, I should like it, but I don't know. Anyway, that's just me. But that's a big deal. Celebrity endorsement. Well, I mean, look, you slap some athlete's name on a pair of shoes or something, and boom, So celebrity endorsements are huge. But this is where you really see it. Oh, there'd been some before the late 1800s, but this is where it really takes hold. Um, Example as far as money spent in advertisements by companies and how it grew. Um, in 1867, about $50 million had been spent in advertisement. In 1900, more than $500 million in advertisements. Um, Now, yeah, it's really kind of interesting to look at this phenomenon of selling products and everything. And so here at the turn of the century, going from the 19th century and the 20th century, we really are going to see the emergence of these department stores, things like this. And I can't help but think today we are in great transition as far as the selling of goods. Of course, if this was a face-to-face class, I would ask you in class, what is this transition? How are things bought now? And I think most people would say a lot of stuff is bought online. Now, I personally kind of like the atmosphere of going to stores and walking around, and I think there's a certain atmosphere there. But yes, it is very convenient to buy online, and so we're kind of in transition, and we're seeing some changes uh, to the selling of goods now. But let's go back again to the latter part of the 1800s and the department store. Alexander Turney Stewart established the first department store in New York City in 1846. It was called the Marble Palace. Um, The building was originally 4 stories over a ground floor supported on cast iron Corinthian column. Um, it was very impressive. It would offer imported clothing, particularly European women's clothing. Um, it even offered the first women's fashion shows, things like this. The This was, I want to say, the Marble Palace. One thing about the department store, it wasn't just to go shop. It was an atmosphere. It was this magnificent place, and that was how a lot of department stores did things to create this really inviting environment, uh, lavish environment. A lot of stores sought to outdo each other with this lavish environment, and that's what we see in the Marble Palace. Now, also, what we're going to see is department stores are going to start to expand throughout a region or even the entire nation. And one of the reasons that that is able to happen is because what? Because of railroads. So now you can have a department store that may first start in New York, but then they open up branch department stores, you might say, in other parts of the country. This is going to be happening. Now, in addition to having those lavish department stores, you also have the flip side developing. Um, you have uh, some department stores that are have a different operating management system in place, or their view is forget about the lavish aspects, forget about just making this a shopping experience per se. Concentrate on low prices, not on opulence. The most noted figure in doing this was Frank W. Woolworth. He opened his first store in Utica, New York in 1879. By 1911, there were 600 Woolworth stores nationwide. There was an advantage to size also. Having all those stores, you got discount in transportation, things like that. Um, you also uh, There was also when we talk about uh, a shopping resort type of atmosphere. On that end, there was a man by the name of John Wanamaker, Wanamaker, and he transformed a Philadelphia railroad depot into an elaborately decorated store called the Grand Depot. So again, you get both sides. You get like the Woolworths, and then you get the Grand Depot and the Marble Palace on the other side. Uh, Woolworths, by the way, they were around up until not too long ago. I think they've, if I'm not mistaken, I think they've all shut down now across the country. But it hasn't been that long ago that Woolworths was they were throughout the country. Anyway, um, well, there was also an untapped market out there. Okay, we're talking mainly about in cities where these department stores are being created. What about rural America? That's an untapped market. They didn't have a lot of access to consumer goods. Um, Now, again, today you can be anywhere in the country and what? Order online. Well, I guess the early online ordering might be considered mail order uh, catalogs, basically. In 1872, Montgomery Ward set out to change that, change the lack of consumer goods out in the rural area. He set out to change the lack of consumer goods in the rural area, and the way he did that is by offering mail order products, printing a mail order catalog, getting mail order catalogs out to the rural areas, and that proved to be pretty successful. It brought consumer goods to the rural area, and when that happened, when Montgomery Ward was effective in doing that, rival mail order businesses started up. Richard F. Sears and Alva C. Roebuck started up a mail order catalog. Sears and Roebuck. Now these mail order companies, end up creating their own department stores. Then stores that had originally been department stores like Macy's and Jordan Marsh and Marshall Field, they began mail order business. So now we're getting competition on that. After the Civil War, there was a rise in the export of manufactured goods. Had the Civil War, horrible time, not a lot of focus on exporting goods to other countries and this type of thing. There was this, horrible war going on. But after the Civil War, not only do we see the increase of demand for, goods here in the country, but also there was demand in foreign countries. And a lot of the industries in America had investments in foreign countries. And there was this idea that was developed that the U.S. had to protect overseas investments. And so that this is going to lead to kind of a thought that the U.S. needed to become more of an imperial power, in other words, power throughout the world, in order to protect overseas investment and to ensure their markets in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, ensure that those markets remained open. And there's going to be a lot of competition with other countries, this type of thing. And, you know, today I'll hear some people say sometimes, well, America's imperialistic today. I would argue that America's not imperialistic today. Yes, we're a world superpower, but imperialism basically means you're going to go over, you're going to take over different countries, this type of thing. Now, we're going to see some imperialism when we get to the Spanish American War and everything. We'll talk about that, what went on there. But again, there's a lot of competition with other countries, and this imperialism was kind of I guess, going around in Europe at that time, European countries had established colonies throughout the world and this type of thing. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. Now, the size of the workforce in America was expanding rapidly as there's more demands for goods, not only in this country but in other countries. You needed more workers. Um, for example, in 1860, there were about 1.3 million workers. We're talking about workers in factories and industries. Um, it goes up to 5.1 million in 1900, and they are um, uh, working in some pretty harsh conditions, which we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Now, new tech, there's going to be an impact of technology. New machines are going to produce more goods in less time and usually will require only low skilled labor to operate them. And these low skilled wagers, these low skilled laborers are going to get low wages. They're going to have to work long hours. Now, for those areas that did need skilled workers, those skilled workers will get paid better. They'll have shorter hours. They'll have better overall treatment. Okay, let's talk about these harsh conditions for the workers. Um, Remember, this chapter is entitled Wonder and Woe. We've talked about some of the wonders already, and the technology, the invention, the magnificent structures being built. But this is the woe part. The workers, their conditions, the condition that they're working under. The success of the industry is dependent upon the workers, but the workers are it's a rough time for them, particularly the low skilled workers. Like I said earlier, the higher skilled workers they had it better off, but the size of the industrial workforce uh, did expand greatly. Uh, the I think I mentioned to you 1.3 million workers in 1860 to 5.1 million workers in 1900. Um, the these conditions, these long hours, low wages, uh, you know, these workers, a lot of them barely are able to meet their basic necessities of life. They would a lot of times these people would have to try to earn additional money by sending their children to work. That's why you have the child labor going on. They might take in boarders in their homes, which they probably didn't have room for them, but they needed to get extra income. Um, there were downturns in the economy. there were severe depressions from 1873 to 1877 and 1893 to 1897, and with these severe economic downturns, there would be contraction of economic growth, widespread business failure, and as a result, there'd be wide rates of unemployment. So now the workers, it was bad enough under the harsh working conditions, but then they lose their jobs. That's really difficult. They are working under very dangerous conditions. Um, like I said, you have the rise in the child labor. Here you see a picture of a couple of little kids working in a factory. It's very easy to lose hands or feet or fingers or toes or even be killed. The monotony of the industrial work made it even more dangerous because it would be so boring, some of the work that they would do, but it's dangerous work, but boring because they're doing it over and over and over again. And so that made things more dangerous. There were no safety laws uh, in place. Like I mentioned before, you got a balance. You got capitalism, which has very positive things related to it, but then if you don't have some sort of safeguard, some sort of regulations in place, you're going to get things like excessively long hours for workers, excessively low pay, excessively dangerous working conditions, child labor, and women working in the factories too under harsh conditions. Um, and so what's going to happen? And by the way, every year between 1880 and 1900, I want you to listen to this figure. 35,000 workers on average were killed on the job, and another 500,000 were injured. Every year between 1880 and 1900. That's an enormous amount of workplace injuries. So, the ways the workers responded was by forming unions and staging strikes and protesting the surge of power of businesses. So we want to look at how kind of a little bit at the development of unions. And that's an interesting history to look at too, because you can see at the beginning how much they were needed to try to push for workers' rights and everything. But if you really do a study of the unions later on, you can see sometimes we're not going to get to that point right now, but sometimes they would overstep. I mean, this is later. This isn't in the early years of union. They were overstepping actually because of their demands were so high. The companies end up shutting down and people would lose their job. But that's a different story. At this time, definitely the unions are having to do something to try to get safety regulations in place, try to get better working conditions, this type of thing. Since profit was the paramount goal of the industrialists would impose strict discipline on their industrial workers. Enforcing the rules would be a manager or foreman. The owner, the industrialist, usually wasn't the one who went around to enforce the rules. He hired a manager or foreman to do that. And the manager or the foreman would really push the workers. They would also fire workers if they thought were being lazy or not pulling their load, this type of thing. Workers usually never did speak directly to their employers. It was rare if they did. Uh, Workers are going to find it, or did find it, very hard to organize labor union. But the first major effort to organize, well, again, there are various reasons for the difficulty in organizing labor unions. One, a lot of times the workers just couldn't agree together. You had just differences of views between skilled laborers, unskilled laborers. You also had racial issues at times, things like this. But anyway, the first major effort to organize the national labor movement after the Civil War began in 1866 when William Sylvis, who was an iron molder, that's Sylvis, he was an iron molder. He founded the National Labor Union, the NLU. It was a federation of independent craft workers, meaning skilled workers. They didn't allow unskilled workers. Um, this union sought to have a federal law enacted for an 8-hour workday. Also sought to have a federal Department of Labor created. But this union didn't last very long. It went out of existence in the 1870s when the economic depression in the 1870s hit. You know, we all talk about the Great Depression, but there have been depressions and recessions throughout our history. They just kind of come and go. But the depression of the 1870s really affected the union because remember, if there's an economic downturn, unions are going to be much less powerful because they're not needed in the factories and everything. So that kind of did them in at that point. Most employers saw unions as threats to their profits and their freedom to run their business as they wanted. So they didn't like unions. A lot of times the industrialists would hire spies to go spy on the workers and make sure they weren't trying to form unions. A lot of times they would blacklist uh, workers. What that meant is, say a worker was trying to, for example, organize a union, and he's working at a particular industry. He gets fired, but then that industrialist, the owner of that industry, will contact owners of industries producing the same items and say, "Hey, don't hire this guy. He's a troublemaker," blacklisting the workers. Employers would hire replacement workers during strikes. Now, the union workers had a not very flattering name for the replacement workers. They called them scabs, but employers would hire replacement workers. And the employers generally got support from the government. They got support from the police. They got support from the judges. They also generally got support from the newspapers at that time. Then the unions usually did not have the financial means to support striking workers. And a lot of times the worker frustration and anger led to violence. Between 1881 and 1905, there were 36,757 strikes involving over 6 million workers. Now, one union, a mining union that was formed was the Workingmen's Benevolent Association. It was formed in response to abusive labor policies in the coal mines. Now, a lot of the coal miners were Irish immigrants, and some of these Irish immigrants formed a secret organization that they called the Molly Maguires. Now, the Molly Maguires really aren't a union. They're what I just said, a secret organization. And but the problem with the Molly Maguires is they were very violent. They carried out acts of violence and intimidation. They would even murder. Sometimes they would murder the foremen or the managers of the industry. Little background on the Molly Maguires. Their name, how did they get that? How did these guys take the name Molly Maguire? It was based on remember I told you they were primarily Irish immigrants. It was based on a legendary Irish heroine um, who supposedly led a revolt of peasant farmers against rent collectors in the 1600s. And the so that's where these miners got the name. They said, okay, here this woman, she led this revolt against the rent collectors, you know, going against the establishment, you might say, and so they took the name of Molly Maguires. The and like I said, they took a lot of they were involved in a lot of violent actions, basically. The They were accused of using murder and terror against their enemies. 10 members were actually convicted of murder and were executed in 1877. So, um, now one thing, the Molly Maguires did not really do a favor to the Workingmen's Benevolent Association because what happened is the industrialists, the mine owners set out to destroy the WBA by convincing the public that it was the same as the Molly Maguires. Uh, and they were able to arrest many of them. On June 21st, 1877, 10, those were the 10 that I just had mentioned to you, 10 were hanged for murder, and 10 more were later hanged. 3 weeks later, on July 14th, 1877, there was a large strike the largest strike in the world occurred in the 19th century. it was the great uprising of railroad workers. So you take what the Molly Maguires were doing, you take the great uprising of the railroad workers that occurred, and the violence that was associated. It wasn't helping the unions basically. And like I said, trying to associate the Molly Maguire or the owners of industry associate the Molly Maguires with the Workingmen's Benevolent Association really worked against the WBA. Uh, the um, uh, the workers, like I said, it's difficult for the workers in forming unions. They faced hostilities from the employers, from politicians, from journalists, um, but also, like I said, within the ranks of the workers. I told you the skilled and the unskilled workers, they were at odds with each other. There were ideological differences a lot of times among the workers. Some of the workers went to the extreme of socialism. A lot of workers didn't want, most workers didn't want socialism. Most wanted capitalism, but they wanted controls in place. There were political differences among the workers. There was racial and ethnic differences that caused some issues. So it was very difficult for the to organize unions. And then there was the talking about the racial and ethnic differences. Um, uh, there had been Chinese immigration, particularly in the western part of the country, and a lot of the workers in industry felt that the Chinese immigrants were taking their jobs, and they pushed to have um, Chinese immigration banned. And actually, this was one case where the government went along with what the workers were asking. You had the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred Chinese immigration to the United States. Again, kind of cares here of ethnic differences that worked against the unions um, being able to organize because you're excluding a lot of workers there. Economic necessity did bring women into the workforce. In 1870, 13% of women worked outside the home. By 1900, it was 20%. Most were single and under the age of 25. So a lot of daughters were sent to the workforce to help the family to survive. Domestic help, some did domestic help, which you didn't have the danger that you had in the factory work, but also there were a lot of women who were now entering the work in the factories, um, and they would work under harsh conditions just like the men, but they would usually be paid about half as much as the men. So the industrialists did like hiring women and children because they paid them less. Of course, the unions are going to be against women and children working. Maybe not so much because of safety issue, but because they were taking the jobs of the men who would get paid more and would have more money to support the family. Um, Not only did you have women working in the dangerous jobs in the industries, but you did also have secretaries and clerks and stenographers in the industry. Women also worked outside of industry, they as teachers or doing social work or nursing. Um, Married women typically left when women got married. They typically left the workforce outside the home. Uh, However, more African American women remained in the workforce after marriage than non African American women. Okay, I told you earlier how, with the industrialists themselves were either considered robber barons or captains of industry, just in general, the vision of industrial capitalism had two different views. There were those who championed capitalism, and there were those who criticized capitalism. Um, you got arguments going on that like that today. Arguments about socialism and capitalism, and let's make sure. And I can't remember if I've gave you definitions, but I'm gonna if I've done it before, I'm gonna go ahead and do it again as far as giving you definitions of capitalism and socialism. But you might as well get those definitions so that you understand when you hear terms like capitalism and socialism, you know what we're talking about. Um, the Capitalism, this is a dictionary definition. Capitalism is an economic system in which investment in and ownership of wealth is made and maintained chiefly by private individuals or corporations, especially as contrasted to cooperatively or state-owned means of wealth. So, simply stated, capitalistic system, it's a private enterprise, basically. Private individuals are, they own the businesses, they run the businesses, they own the businesses. The In socialism, who's the owner of the businesses of the industries? It's the government. Socialism, here's the definition: ownership and control of the means of production and distribution of capital, land, etc., in the community as a whole, which means basically it's going to be government owned. Um, you talk about things like, you hear debates about government run healthcare. Well, that would not be privately run. Privately run would be capitalistic. If it's government run, it would be socialistic, whatever. Um, so those are the differences. And like I said, even today, there's a lot of debate. You hear it a lot now because in this election year, you hear some politicians who have stated that they are socialist, and then they make their point, and then the people proponents of capitalism make their point about capitalism. So this issue of, you know, capitalism good or capitalism bad or whatever, that's been going on for quite some time. Uh, um, so let's talk about, at this time in the latter part of the 1800s, what are the arguments for and against capitalism? Okay. Well, let's see. The positive aspects about capitalism that people argued was that capitalism meant progress. It meant more consumer goods. It meant new inventions. It meant new forms of transportation. It meant increased food production, lower food prices. It meant rising life expectancy because of the goods being produced this time, type of thing. It meant that real wages were rising over 50% between 1816 and 1900. It meant that jobs were being created. It meant countless products, basically. Um, Carnegie was one who really promoted the virtues of capitalism. He said, quote, without the hope of future riches, business leaders would not have the incentive to seek new opportunities, take risks, and develop new products. That's an important sentence. Without the hope of, or quote from Carnegie, without the hope of future riches, business leaders would not have the incentive to seek new opportunities, take risks, and develop new products. That's kind of the essence of capitalism right there. It causes people to, individuals to take risks and seek to develop new products and better things. Um, Also, those who championed capitalism said, look, industrialists will use their fortune to fund philanthropic projects. Like we mentioned Carnegie and Rockefeller earlier. The so and they'll also, the proponents of capitalism would really promote the um, story of rags to riches, how capitalism gave individuals the opportunity to rise from rags to riches. This is particularly, you can see this in the writings of an author by the name of Horatio Alger. Horatio Alger was an American author of novels for boys, and he became really famous for his stories about boys who rose from poverty to wealth and fame through hard work, virtuous living, and some luck. Um, Alger's works reinforced an image of the United States as a land where dreams of material prosperity, high social position, and power could come true. Um, if people, the name Horatio Alger is still used to describe fictional and real life individuals who achieve rags to riches success through their own efforts. Um, that's part of capitalism. This idea that everybody has the opportunity, can make it. you can rise from poverty to wealth, and we see that today. We've seen that repeated. We've seen that people rising to political power who came from very modest backgrounds. We see people rising to great economic power who came from modest backgrounds. This type of thing. So those are all you know arguments for capitalism being good, or supporting the cause of capitalism. Now there is one justification for capitalism that I think might be viewed as a kind of a very harsh way to view capitalism as being it's good because this is what it means, and that is social Darwinism. It's kind of like I said, it's kind of a rough justification of capitalism, I would say. Social Darwinism basically is a corruption of the British naturalist Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection. And if you're familiar, biology people, y'all know about Charles Darwin and the idea of survival of the fittest when it comes to in the animal world and plant world and this type of thing. Well, the British philosopher and sociologist Herbert Spencer took Darwin's ideas of natural selection of plants and animals, the idea of natural selection whereby plants and animals are able to adapt to changing conditions, survive, while those that can't adapt will go extinct. And what social Darwinism says is basically this survival of the fittest can be applied to the modern industrial society. So those who were promoting capitalism saw no need for government involvement because the strongest will survive. Again, I think that's kind of a brutal way to justify capitalism. In that regard, I think you're probably better off talking about the positive things that result from capitalism, but to say, well, just to survival of the fittest, if the people are getting killed working in the factories, well, that's just survival of the fittest, or what I'd say. That's pretty harsh, pretty harsh. But that also was a justification for capitalism with social Darwinism. Um, Now, what about those who criticized, criticized capitalism? Let's go to the next slide. Those who criticized capitalism complained that there was a widening gap between the rich and the poor. Um, they basically um, said that they supported a single tax on land value and they wanted a more equitable society. Um, Edward Bellamy wrote a novel in 1887 called Looking Backward, 2000 to 1887. And in this book, he envisioned a utopian society, that's an idealistic society, in the year 2000 where government would control the economy. That's socialism. Okay. Most workers accepted capitalism, but many felt that greedy monopolists were in league with unscrupulous politicians and that they had seized control of the economy and they were bent in using it towards their own advantage. Let's talk some more about the unions. Okay, so like I just said, and I'm going to repeat it, most of the workers did accept capitalism. They didn't want to do away with capitalism. They didn't want to create a socialist society, but they did want better working conditions. They did want more regulation, government regulation on industry, this type of thing. And, this is what really prompts unions to be formed. I've already talked about a couple of attempts on unions, um, but we're going to get a major union that is established in 1869. Um, a man by the name of Uriah Stevens and some other Philadelphia garment cutters founded the Knights, and it was a secret union. Basically, that was one of the things they were very secretive, and that's going to hurt them actually. The They actually are going to become the world's largest industrial union, but their policy of strict secrecy bothered a lot of people. People don't trust organizations too much if they're really secretive, and they were. And today you hear politicians a lot talk about transparency. don't keep things secret. Now, whether these politicians are transparent or not, we can debate some of that. But this policy of strict secrecy hurt the union. Also, what hurt the union was in the 1870s. You had the economic depression of the 1870s, and that's going to hurt union membership because remember, the unions do better when the economy is doing well because the workers are more in demand. But by 1879, with the policy of strict secrecy and with the economic depression, there were only 10,000 members in the Knights of Labor. Okay. Um, so, what helps the Knights of Labor? I said they become the largest union in the country. Uh, how did they do that after the decline in the 1870s? Well, two major developments. One, the economy revived, so they came out of the depression. That's going to help with the union and union membership. And two, and this is a biggie, a machinist by the name of Terence Powderly becomes the Grand Master Workman. That's the head of the union. Powderly abolished the secrecy rule. That was huge. No longer they're gonna do everything in secret. And two, he was a very good speaker and organizer, so that was really good. The Knights of Labor are going to come to emphasize economic justice and democracy. Workers in New York, Knights of Labor workers in New York City were inspired to establish a Labor Day holiday in September of 1882. And we still celebrate Labor Day. It wasn't a national holiday in 1882. That happened in 1894 when President Cleveland signed a law making Labor Day a holiday for federal workers. But the Knights of Labor they were very inclusive. Uh, Skilled and unskilled. They included African Americans. They also allowed women members. They emphasized some practical goals: 8-hour workday, equal pay for men and women, establishment of state bureaus of labor, prohibition of child and convict labor. Again, unions didn't like the child labor, not just because, it was brutal on children, but also because the children were taking the jobs of men and the industrials were paying them a lot less than men, and they didn't like that. One of the things that's going to help get rid of child labor is you're going to start getting states enacting required required enrollment in school. Okay, so that's going to help. Anyway, the KOL or the Knights of Labor, they do lead some successful strikes. Um, the uh, the strikes, they can be successful, but also um, a strike can work against the unions, and that's going to happen with the Haymarket incident in Chicago. That incident is going to actually hurt the unions. Like I said, the strikes could be effective and help unions, or um, there could be negative impact of some things that the unions uh, would do. And the Haymarket incident was something that had a really negative effect. Now, before the Haymarket incident, the Knights of Labor, they had led a successful strike against the railroads owned by Jay Gould in 1885. Now, they did also have um, a strike against schools, railroads the next year in 1886 that was not very successful. But what really hurts the union, all unions, including the Knights of Labor, was the Haymarket riot in Chicago in 1886. Um, this was a very violent incident. It occurred. There had been uh, workers, basically. This was a time when workers throughout the country were periodically on strike. And what happens here is there's been a strike at an industrial plant in Chicago, and there was a rally being held at Haymarket Square. Well, the rioting is going to occur after someone throws a bomb that fatally wounds 7 policemen and 1 civilian. In the rioting, the police and the crowd exchanged gunfire, and many police officers and spectators were wounded. Um, and what as a follow-up to it, on August 20th, 1886, 8 anarchists were, because the leaders of the rally were anarchists. Anarchists are people who want to abolish government authority. You hear talk about anarchists today, even. Um, well, on August 20th, 1886, 8 anarchists were convicted of conspiracy against the police in reference to the Haymarket incident. None of them were found guilty of throwing the bomb, because that was, nobody was ever found out who exactly threw the bomb, or of causing the death. But nevertheless, 7 of the 8 anarchists were sentenced to death, and the eighth was sentenced to prison. Now, in 1887, 4 of the 7 were hanged. One ended up committing suicide, and the remaining 2 were sentenced to prison again. In 1893, the 3 survivors ended up being pardoned by the governor of Illinois, who declared that the evidence had been insufficient to support the charges. So, but the damage was really done by the Haymarket incident. The Haymarket riot increased anti-labor feelings, weakened the radical element of the labor movement. Now, on the flip side, it did strengthen the movement toward having a more pure and simple unionism that condemned violence. But the extreme radicalism, definitely, there was a crackdown on that. And the KOL ends up being weakened by the split, kind of the split between the more violent elements and those who wanted a more peaceful approach. Um, Skilled workers felt that the KOL had become too extreme, and they end up organizing the American Federation of Labor. The extreme elements thought that Powderly was too conservative, and also the Knights of Labor, they were getting bad press because, I mean, this basically everybody was condemning what happened in the Haymarket uh, incident. It was being condemned by the press. It was being condemned by the public. It was being condemned pretty much across the board. And uh, so membership ends up dropping in the Knights of Labor. They went from 700,000 in 1886 to 100,000 in 1890. Um, After 1886, the leader of the labor movement went to the AFL, the American Federation of Labor that I just mentioned to you. The AFL was led by Samuel Gompers, and the AFL, American Federation of Labor, focused on higher wages, shorter hours, and job security, kind of a common theme in unions. They rejected organizing unskilled workers because they thought unskilled workers were too weak and unreliable. So it was a skilled workers organization. They were exclusionary. They excluded African Americans, women, and recent immigrants were excluded. Eventually, the AFL is going. Well, what happens is within the AFL, uh, you had a committee. It was called the Committee for Industrial Organization. Now I'm kind of fast forwarding, going up a few years. In 1935, 8 leaders of the AFL union set up this committee, the Committee for Industrial Organization, to carry on an organizing drive um, in the industries. And the Committee of Industrial Organization tried to sign up all workers, skilled and unskilled. Remember, the AFL was just skilled workers, but now this committee is going after unskilled too. So there was a disagreement over this type of organizing, and so the AFL ends up. So the AFL is kind of like an umbrella union, and they'll have kind of, you might say, sub unions underneath, and they end up suspending 10 national unions that were participating in the Committee for Industrial Organization. So what happens is the Committee for Industrial Organization forms its own labor union in 1938 and changed its names to the Congress of Industrial Organization. But later, the AFL and the CIO formally merged in 1955. So I'm not going to go any further with it, but they do merge together, and you have the AFL CIO basically. All right, so that's basically our unit, and I hope you uh, make sure you understand what's going on, this why this chapter is wonder and woe, what's going on with the wonder, what's going on with the woe, and just make sure you review everything, and we'll move on from there.